a large section of the population is now struggling.
They've been misled or they misunderstand. It's systematic corrosion that compounds through time. It's about centralisation and control.
Yeah.
And it all starts with the money. If you centralise the money, you can control everything. The cost of living, the forever wars, the obesity crisis, homelessness, all of these things. Breakdown of the nuclear family. We always recognise these as issues and growing issues in society. We perhaps don't understand is that they share a root cause. They're not separate things. And it's the quality of the money.
For people who haven't yet seen what's the problem, tell us about the big red button.
The whole framework for modern economics is backward. It effectively boils down to you need inflation. There's always an excuse to restore confidence in the banking sector and in markets by printing money. The perfect money is one that you hold yourself. You don't need somebody else to look after it for you. It's as much about sovereignty as it is purchasing power. We live in a world now where it is considered absolutely normal or the default state that you have someone else look after your money. So I said, well, if I can create something that anybody can watch, and after 30 minutes, they understand why we need Bitcoin, and they're motivated then to take the next step and actually learn about it, then that's a win. It gives people firm foundations in understanding what happens in free markets with sound money and the benefits that naturally accrue to humanity in those scenarios, and then what happens when you undermine that through the use of the big red button.
Joe Bryan got it right.
He got it right.
Welcome to the studio. Really happy to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here, Archie. Thanks for
the
right? invite.
Yeah, good journey coming in.
Oh, it was a nightmare, but I'm here now.
It was all worth the effort. I hope we're going to make it worth the effort, man.
Definitely.
So, what's the problem, man?
Well, the problem is the people can print for free what you have to work for.
That's true. I think it's been distilled into a meme so perfectly. They print what you have to work for, and it perfectly encapsulates the injustice of it all, really. And when you think about the struggle that people go through day to day to make a living, and that somehow someone somewhere else can just print out of thin air what we have to strive and struggle our entire lives for. And really, the way people are living now, a lot of people are getting crushed, absolutely crushed. And it's no longer the case that we can look at a certain segment of society and attribute their struggles to perhaps some personal shortcomings. It's such a large section of society that it can be nothing less than a failure in policy. You can't say that suddenly the entire country, and this is quite common in many Western countries as well. So I'm very familiar with Australia, the United States, of course, and I've been living in the United Kingdom for a long time. Quite a common thing in all of those countries to different extents, that a large section of the population is now struggling. And that can't be anything less than a failure in policy. It's not like people have suddenly lost their work ethic. I think people work extremely hard. I think it's very lazy analysis to say, oh, you just got to work harder, you got to hustle more, you need a side hustle. It can't be that.
It's not that.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's systematic corrosion that compounds through time.
That's so succinctly put. Looking for a secure, trusted way to buy, sell, and hold Bitcoin? Gemini has been leading the way since 2014. Founded by the Winklevoss twins to be a security-first, fully regulated Bitcoin platform. With Gemini, your Bitcoin is protected with enterprise-grade security, backed by insurance and Type 2 certifications for SOC 1 and SOC 2. Whether you're new to Bitcoin or a long-time hodler, Gemini gives you the tools to stack sats and build generational wealth your way. From simple one-tap buys to advanced charts and trading features, it's all here. Buy, sell, and hold securely. That's Gemini. Gemini. Bitcoin with confidence. Need cash without selling your Bitcoin? With DeBiFi, you borrow against your Bitcoin, non-custodial, multi-sig escrow, And you keep your keys. No banks, no selling. Just institutional grade liquidity with terms up to 2 years and APRs as low as 9%. All transactions are signed using private keys on your own device. Using a 3 of 4 multi-sig setup, 3 out of 4 keys must approve every transaction, giving you control, transparency, and peace of mind. Whether you're a hodler, miner, small business, or treasury team, DeBiFi gives you the cash you need now without giving up your Bitcoin upside or triggering a taxable event. Get liquidity, keep exposure, and stay secure. That's DeBiFi. DeBiFi, your Bitcoin, your money. The reason I brought you in here is because you've made a fantastic, I guess we can call it a documentary.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
I don't know what to call it because it's, it's so beautifully and simply put together. It's essentially you speaking into the camera and explaining the story of what's the problem. And it feels like you are having a conversation with a friend in your living room. So can you just give us a bit of a backstory to how you came to put together what's the problem? Because it has a really interesting backstory and perhaps reflected in the style of delivery.
Well, I mean, it probably feels like I'm talking to you in the video because I didn't do a script for it. Having not made a video before, and I'll tell you where the video came from in a moment, but it would seem sensible to write something ahead of time. Whereas I'd given the presentation a number of times, and then when I went to film it, we ran through it a couple of times, and I just said different things to the camera each time. So it wasn't reading off a script; it was just the way that I think about things and the way that I would explain it to somebody. So I think that natural delivery is quite nice and seems to resonate with people. But I didn't intend to create the video in the first place. I only created the video in the first place because I made a presentation of the same slides for some people to try and get them to the point where they wanted to learn about Bitcoin.
And so what was the impetus to putting that slide set together? I'm really interested in the accumulation of moments with different people in different circumstances that led you to think, I need to put this together in a slide deck. So what happened? How did that happen?
I was sort of forced to.
Yeah. How?
I was forced to put something together about something. And so I was invited to a weekend away with a friend, and he invited a bunch of his friends from his life to go and spend the weekend with him in Portugal. And so he had people from, North America, Africa, Europe, most of whom didn't know each other. And he said, right, just come, we'll spend a few days together. Everyone bring something to talk about for half an hour. It can be on this sort of loose topic of, sort of self-improvement. And I thought, well, Bitcoin fits that topic. Yeah, I could justify, thinking about money, thinking about the future and, the way that you spend your time as fitting the brief. And then I had to go and create something to talk about. But I didn't know anyone. I didn't know who they were, what their background was, what they knew or didn't know. And so I had to create something that was accessible to everybody. But I only had 30 minutes. And so you're not going to be able to explain, everything about Bitcoin to somebody starting from zero in 30 minutes. So I just said, well, if I can create something that anybody can watch, and after 30 minutes, they understand why we need Bitcoin, and they're motivated then to take the next step and actually learn about it, then that's a win.
One of the things that I like, I love the whole thing, by the way, but I think the narrative arc of the whole thing is like so simple and so beautiful in the way that you deliver. I mean, you're a very softly spoken fella, but it's direct and to the point. I imagine like me being direct and to the point would have a different tenor to you being direct and to the point. For example, it might appear like I'm shouting someone down, but you have a very softly spoken voice, very, very calm demeanor, and it really helps draw the viewer into the message. And you start in a very simple spot, almost like it's right at the beginning where you set the stage for two separate societies divided by this mythical wall. Can you take it from there and explain to us?
Well, yeah, I mean, but even before that, one of the things I wanted to do was to draw everybody in. Because the title is just what's the problem? It doesn't mention Bitcoin. And the introduction doesn't mention Bitcoin. The middle doesn't mention Bitcoin. It's only at the very end that you talk about Bitcoin. Because if this is a Bitcoin video, people just wouldn't watch it.
Yeah, it's the Amway tactic, right?
It's what, sorry?
You know what Amway is? It's
No.
Okay.
No.
I don't mean to disparage your work in saying this, but they do something very similar because they know what the reaction would be if someone says, "Is this an Amway presentation?" And they're instructed to say, "No, it's not," because then people relax and they open themselves up to the message, right? And then at the end they tell you, "Well, this is Amway. Join us," right? That's what they do. So I guess you're right though. People do have a visceral reaction and a reflexive one when you tell them it's Bitcoin because they're just filled with such prejudices through the media.
They've been misled or they misunderstand. Neither of which is necessarily their own fault. But you need people to be open to hearing what you have to say if you want them to hear it. And so the very start of the presentation is just a list of problems. I could have written loads of problems on there, and some people say, well, this problem's not on there, or that problem's not on there. It's like, well, I just picked some and I put them down. But, the cost of living, the forever wars, the obesity crisis, homelessness, all of these things, breakdown of the nuclear family. And I just say, look, we all see these, we all recognize these as issues and growing issues in society. And they may impact you or someone that but they're real. Right? But what we perhaps don't understand is that they share a root cause. They're not separate things. And it's the quality of the money. And by framing it like that up front, you're sort of inviting people in to then understand how this, how the big red button, the visual big red button in the middle actually delivers all of these problems.
Mm.
But then you suck them into the story. And the story is, again, nice and soft. It's Pixar characters. And, it's it's a narrative arc. But it's a narrative arc which gives people firm foundations in understanding what happens in free markets with sound money and the benefits that naturally accrue to humanity in those scenarios. And then what happens when you undermine that through the use of the big red button.
Yeah, the big red button is, if for people who haven't yet seen what's the problem, tell us about the big red button.
So, go back slightly. It's on a make-believe world. There's a ship traveling across this ocean. It's got hundreds of smart people, and then they effectively capsize on the edge of this deserted island. But the deserted island has all the resources they could possibly need to rebuild society. But because they've come from an advanced civilization, they know ultimately where they're going to get back to. They're smart people. They just don't have tools. They're just starting from scratch again. And so, you have to suspend your disbelief and say, they don't have anything. They're in rags and, scratching out a living, but they can create whatever monetary system they want with whatever characteristics, and then any supporting technology, and you sort of conveniently ignore that. And then they discuss amongst themselves and they agree on what they consider to be the characteristics of perfect money. And it just describes Bitcoin without saying Bitcoin. But you can understand why those characteristics are the characteristics of perfect money, but because the characteristics is by definition. And so you then have this split. Two leaders emerge, one called Satoshi, which is a bit of a giveaway if you know Bitcoin, and one called Fiatello to represent all fiat currencies.
Sorry to the Italian listeners. You might take offense at Fiatello.
Fiatello. I just needed a name that had fiat in there. I think it actually works. It works quite well. And he says, well, I know we all agree on the characteristics, but there might be an emergency. We might need to change one of those characteristics of perfect money. So we should just create a big red button that we can have over in the corner. No one will ever press it, but somebody can, at any point in time and change any of the characteristics. But no one will, of course. It's
But
just
no
there.
one will. Just in case.
Just in case. Just there for emergencies. And then Satoshi says, well, I can't get on board with that. Just having the option is wrong. Because if you have the option, it's going to get used. He says, no, I'm never going to use it. It'll get used. So they can't agree, and so build a big wall down the middle of the island, and then you split the society into two distinct civilizations that don't communicate and don't trade. But they're both starting with perfect money because Fiatello hasn't pressed the big red button to begin with. So they both evolve in a consistent way, and then you reach a tipping point where the button ultimately does get pressed.
It feels like Bitcoin Twitter and crypto Twitter. We both exist on the same platform, but we don't really talk to each other.
Well, I guess there's probably some people who straddle the two. But
Secretly.
Sometimes secretly, but the direction of travel of crypto is just fiat. And so the direction of travel across the world is ultimately only one net direction over time. And so there's, you could think about crypto or fiat being on the Fiatello side. Cryptello is the next leader of that side. But before he presses the big red button, we go through, a story of them trying to survive on the island, which gives people a firm foundation in free market economics and what naturally happens when you just leave people alone. Like, what are the consequences of natural human action from first principles within 2 minutes? Because most people have, either not really thought about it before, they haven't had any sort of meaningful formal education in economics, or they've been taught the wrong thing. Because the whole framework for modern economics is backward. It's backward because...
Elaborate on that.
It's backward because it effectively boils down to you need inflation. And, we can maybe come back to that. But the natural outcome when you have perfect money is that prices fall and quality goes up. And then within 2 minutes, people realize that's the natural state of the world. And then they have this, cognitive dissonance because it's like, well, that's not what I see around me today. But when prices fall and quality goes up through human action and specialization, innovation, you get the quality of life lifting for everybody on both sides of the island. The money becomes more valuable over time rather than less. And so even the unproductive people in society see the benefit. Because whether somebody is infirm or old or hampered in some way from being productive, they still see the benefit of society. And this is what we see. This is what we will see when Bitcoin is the money of the world, because it's the global free market where everybody's operating in their own self-interest, the benefit of everyone else. Everybody wins in that scenario. It lifts all the boats. Which is, and people see that and they go, well, that's obviously true. That's obviously true. Logical steps. And then you get this separation, because for the very first time, Fiatello's tempted to press the button. Because even in a perfectly well-run scenario, when you have a governance structure of whatever kind, and it doesn't matter what the type of government is because they're all the same, you're going to have some level of taxes across the population for some degree of shared services or protection or something like this.
And it doesn't matter what level. People who are ideologically driven might say less is always better, and others might say, no, we need more. Whatever it is, it needs to be funded one way or the other.
Exactly.
Right? So
it's not zero.
This story is not ideologically driven or aligned in any way, because whatever your ideology, governments need to be funded at some level, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you have any government or any governance structure for collaboration of any degree, it will need to be funded. I mean, you've probably got, the anarchists at one end who say like you shouldn't
even
need
have a
any,
state. Yeah.
you shouldn't need any of that. But I think with human nature, those things tend to emerge naturally anyway, and so it's a fair assumption to assume that they will be there to some degree. Whether it's small, medium, or large is up to the election structure and the way the governance works. However, there will become a point in time where the spending is greater than the collection of the taxes, and so there's a deficit, and we're all very familiar with deficits these days. And so on Satoshi's side of the island, because he's using perfect money, he has to either raise the taxes or cut the spending to balance the books. There's no alternative. But there's an election coming up, and he loses the election because he is unable to hide any changes from the population. Whereas for Fiatello, he says, well, I could raise the taxes or cut spending, or I could just this once, just print a bit of extra money for the government to fund what we need to fund without having to communicate anything to the public, and he gets re-elected. And so he thinks it's great. It's great. I can press this big red button, the public don't even know, and I get into power for another 4 years. And that's when we see this divergence start to occur, and Fiatello's side of the island just snowballs into looking exactly like today. So going from a world with perfect money, where prices fall and quality goes up and everyone is self-sovereign, because this is an area that is often overlooked in the story, because we think about it in financial terms, but it's as much about sovereignty as it is purchasing power, because the perfect money is one that you hold yourself. You don't need somebody else to look after it for you.
Yeah, and that's been slowly eroded to the point where we don't hold our own money. I mean, excluding Bitcoin, we don't hold our own money now in the United Kingdom, and certainly even to a greater extent in the European Union, where cash is now de facto criminalized beyond any. I think in Europe it might be above 1,000 euros or 2,000 or 3,000 euros, and it's a similar thing in the United Kingdom. Simply holding that level of cash is a cause for suspicion.
Yeah.
Which is outrageous.
It is outrageous.
I mean, you can own a £20,000 watch, jewelry, anything else, but you're not allowed to hold £20,000 in cash without inviting suspicion. And I guess if for any reason your home was raided or police visited for a break-in and they found that amount of cash, you would be under investigation for that. And there's no guarantee that you would get it back at all, because only bad people hold cash, apparently.
Well, this is the thing. Financial privacy and self-sovereignty are not crimes. They're not.
Yeah.
But they are increasingly framed as such. It's guilty until proven.
Do we have a UK equivalent to civil forfeiture as they do in the United States? Are you familiar with civil forfeiture?
Where the police stop you and then,
take it and
you have to apply for it back.
The assumption is that the money is guilty, not you. So they don't even have to charge you with the crime to take away your money. Just the fact that the money exists in the vehicle is cause for suspicion of you, but they can actually confiscate the money, and the money it doesn't make sense. The money is guilty. Right? So they don't even, it's not even incumbent upon them to come up with a reason to charge you in order to take your property away.
It's the suspicion.
It's simply the existence of that money. And that's quite an egregious thing in and of itself. But then when you have a look at what actually happens to that money is then used by the police force that's doing the confiscation, and it goes into their local funds to use however they fit. It's totally up to their discretion. I think John Oliver did a segment on this some time ago, and it was like, this one police department had a margarita machine that they spent the money on, and a whole bunch of sort of superfluous nonsense like that, right? So you can suddenly see like, if you have full discretion over the money you confiscate and how that's used, and the chances of it ever being redistributed to the rightful owners are quite slim.
Yep.
Well, then, it's a huge window of opportunity for them to exploit and abuse the power to do that. And of course, that's what they do every time they stop someone over there hunting for some cash.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have anything like that in the United Kingdom? I haven't heard of anything.
You see things on X of videos people post on X and things, but I think it's just a general direction of travel. And you see it
because bank account freezes are very common now.
Very common, hundreds of thousands every year.
Yeah, and
get frozen.
It's really difficult to get a clear explanation in a timely way, and there's no real due process.
They're actually not allowed to tell you. They're not allowed under the money laundering regulations to actually tell you, that you're under suspicion or any of the reasons why.
But your bank account is frozen. Your funds are frozen, and if that's your only bank account and your only source of funds, you could lose your home, you could lose your job, you could lose, it could completely ruin and devastate your life.
Yeah. And so this is why Bitcoin, is so important.
It absolutely is.
It's peer-to-peer electronic cash. You don't need those third parties. And this is why perfect money is one that you hold yourself. We live in a world now where it is considered absolutely normal, or the default state, that you have someone else look after your money.
Yeah.
That's the latest stop on the direction of travel we've been on throughout humanity. It's not the last stop. The last stop is going all the way back to the very beginning and being fully self-sovereign again.
It occurred to me a few weeks ago that one of my daily pleasures is a decent cup of coffee. As anyone who's sort of followed me diligently would know, it's quite often my morning greeting to the Bitcoin Twitter crowd. And I realized that if I wanted to pay by cash for my local coffee at a good coffee shop, I wouldn't be able to buy a coffee. None of the local specialty coffee shops accept cash. They're all cashless. And so that sort of crept up on us since COVID. And now I'm realizing, but what if you were not even banked? Like, what if you can't even get a decent cup of coffee? And where else is that creeping into? It's pretty much everywhere. I don't know, we've gone into a sort of discussion on...
everywhere. It's about centralization and control.
Yeah.
And it all starts with the money. If you centralize the money, you can control everything.
I want to go back to the temptation to smack the big red button.
Yeah, okay.
Because in your example... And I remember, I know they've been doing this for quite some time, but I remember 2008 was the big red button moment for me in my sort of living memory. And, if we use the United States as the example, the Barack Obama's administration came up with an enormous number, $800 billion.
Sounds small these days.
Well, it does these days. Back then, it was an unimaginably large number. And the motivation for choosing 800 billion was that we wanted to overwhelm the market with positivity and reassurance. And so they just picked the biggest number that they thought they could pass through Congress for approval. And 800 billion was the number. And now we're talking trillions, right? And so that was a big red button where they thought it's an emergency. We have to inject liquidity into the market. They pressed the button. And then the next time we had COVID, they were already accustomed to pressing the button because, I think we had 2 liquidity cycles since 2008. So Bitcoin was launched in 2009 after the big red button moment, thank Satoshi. And as we've come to realize that Bitcoin essentially since then has followed the liquidity cycle, the global liquidity cycle. And I think, what did we have? We had 2013, 2017, 2021. So essentially we've had 3 liquidity cycles up and down, and now we're about to enter into the 4th one now. So each time, so this is the crucial bit about the big red button. The first time you do it, it may well not be electoral bribes. It may well be an emergency like the financial crisis of 2008, which was brought about because of I guess, banking profligacy, lack of risk management controls, deregulation in certain parts. That
it was brought about by the fact that the big red button existed.
So bring us to that point then.
So, a lot of these, because the big red button is not necessarily just printing money. It's making any changes to the characteristics of money. And so over time, that ends up splintering to corrupt lots of characteristics of money, just very slowly over time. But the most visible one is just printing the money. So the fact that the banking sector was able to get so leveraged is because 2008 was not the first time that we printed money. It was just the first time that we had such a big number. And for you as an individual, and for me as an individual, it was the first sort of wow moment from a big red button pressing perspective in the financial markets. People who are 10, 20 years older will have earlier memories. Long-term capital management, for example, or, the dot-com crash, all of these different things. Because there's always an excuse to restore confidence in the banking sector and in markets by printing money, by expanding the balance sheet, expanding the monetary supply. All has the same effect, but historically, they all look small relative to the last one, right? Because each time, the amount you have to print is just so much bigger because you're compounding the issues you've created from the last time you did it.
Yeah. And if you are a financial institution and you'll be bailed out, when you're going to step on that risk, step on the gas in terms of taking risk to the maximum, because you're not going to have to bear the losses. Someone come in and step in and save you, which is the government inevitably.
Exactly, and the bigger you are, the safer you are.
That's literally policy.
That is policy, because when you have these cycles of banking system or speculation running ahead of itself, and then you have a drawback in assets or pullback in asset prices, whatever it is, right? Then money has to be printed to shore up the system. But some things fail at the edges. The banks with the weakest balance sheets fail, or the ones that have gone too far into one particular area of lending, they fail, and they're almost considered like, one or two, three have to fail to trigger the Fed into stepping in and saying, like, this is now a crisis, so we'll underpin everything by just money printing. But what happens is, often they're not actually allowed to fail, they're just folded into the bigger banks. The bigger banks are given sweetheart deals to buy Lehman or Bester and so these things. And quite often in those deals, the taxpayer takes the downside, the bank takes the upside. So the bigger banks say, well, you're having to print money, otherwise the whole thing fails. But I don't want to buy that bank over there because they're too leveraged. They've got too many toxic assets. So I'll buy them for pennies on the dollar. But you underwrite me if we lose. And if we win, we'll keep it.
Well, it's even worse than that. Quite often the government takes most of the toxic assets away from the company that's going to be taken over. And the acquiring bank gets essentially all the good bits, including the brand and any other assets. And then they're underwritten on that. So they're not even really taking any of the risk. The government takes all of the risk and the long tail of asset write-downs with the toxic assets as well.
Yeah, through the creation of bad banks or
we
bad
had
banks.
that happen,
and we have that. It just shifts those losses on day one onto the government's balance sheet, and then over 5-10 years they're gradually forgotten about, but they incur losses over time, which just requires more money printing, expands the monetary base, which dilutes everyone's wealth. So it's socialized losses and privatized gains. But this only exists because the big red button exists. If the big red button did not exist, you would have a free market mechanism which would cause banks to die if they got over leveraged, which then cleans out the system. But we're at a point in time now where we've parlayed all of these smaller bailouts and just injected more and more centralized risk into the system, so that even the smallest change now causes everything to fall out of bed. And the only solution is even more money printing. But at some point, the rubber needs to hit the road, and some pain has to be felt by somebody. Because through the actions of the big red button, we've incentivized a debt-based economy with ever greater levels of lending and leverage with lower and lower standards.
Well, we can contrast that approach to what Iceland did in the global financial crisis. Iceland put their bankers in jail for negligence, fraud, all sorts of things, right? And they were told, hey, if you do that, actually the markets will punish you. They will remember and they will punish you. You won't be able to attract any investment into the country. Mm-hmm. And quite the opposite happened, because investors really only care about the future, not really the past. And if prices are attractive enough, you will attract investors from somewhere, unless you're a banana republic and the rule of law does not exist. But if you're upholding the law, and holding bankers accountable for breaking that law, well, then actually that presents as a very healthy place to do business, because predictability with respect to the rule of law is one of the pillars of attracting investment into your country. And so they recovered a lot faster than the UK recovered, which took the complete opposite tack and bailed out the banks. Hardly anybody, well, I don't even think anybody of significance within the banking industry went to jail or was charged or anything. Maybe some low-level trader who was sort of hung out to dry. Was similar happened in America, but none of the banking executives went to jail.
You've touched on two interesting points there. The first is trust in enforcement, and the second is asset prices. So just because Iceland put their bankers in jail once doesn't mean it'll happen again. Everything's just about trust. If you have to trust, that trust will be broken in whatever way, in whatever country, in whatever sector, in whatever governance structure. Ultimately, it will be broken. So you cannot allow yourself to be subject to having to trust somebody. It's Bitcoin. Secondly, you said if asset prices become attractive enough, asset prices are not allowed by design to become attractive enough, because we don't live in a free market anymore. Because the banking system tends towards ever greater leverage in nominal terms, so actual dollar amounts. And because the purchasing power of the dollars goes down over time, the dollars, the Fiatellos, they're all the same. The size of the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The lending standards weaken, and the effective buffer that the banking sector has gets eroded away against any change in asset prices. And so the more leverage you inject everywhere into economy, into lower quality assets with lower standards, it only takes a very small drop in asset prices to effectively render the banking system insolvent. And so every time the asset prices fall, it's panic stations. Everyone's looking to the Fed. Like, when are you going to press the big red button? You need to press the big red button. You need to restore confidence in the markets. We don't live in a free market. What should happen is asset prices fall. The people who are over leveraged lose. But the prices fall enough that it activates fresh capital from people who have savings to then come back into the market. That's how a free market works.
And that should be the stabilizing mechanism for an economy, right?
That is the free market stabilization mechanism.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the challenges people have, and the question I sometimes get with, if there isn't a big red button, what happens when COVID arrives or there's a natural disaster or something like this, who's going to print the money to save everybody? They say, well,
that's a fair question, right? People are concerned about...
It's a very fair question.
Yeah.
It's a very fair question, but it presupposes that's required. And it presupposes that's required because we don't see what should happen because the rules have been changed. What should happen is asset prices fall. Because if asset prices fall, they will reach a point where they become attractive again. And people deploy their savings back into the assets because now the risk reward is there and it's the stabilisation mechanism. Now, COVID is a slight example because you'd say, some of it was a lot of it was self-inflicted because of the decisions governments took to basically stop commerce. But also it changes the decision making. It makes people much more accountable for those things because you can't print the money. So there's a higher threshold. You can have insanity lasts much shorter period of time because you can't balance the budget. And so the free market is the best natural correcting mechanism that we have. Just leave people alone.
So people is one thing, but let's talk about how a government would fund itself in an emergency where the requirement for action needs funding beyond what the budget can provide for.
Governments can still borrow. But how do you fund your family in an emergency? You don't get to print money.
No, we can borrow or we can spend savings. Yeah.
Exactly the same. But without the ability to print money, you have to do that in a prudent way. You are held accountable for the decisions that you take. If you have access to a big red button, there is zero accountability because there will always be a set of circumstances where you can justify pressing the big red button.
The economic theory was always that, in good times you have surpluses and in bad times you have deficits. You use up those surpluses to balance out, the budget over the long term. But we found that actually that's not the case. There's just a perpetual deficit. And so there's, I guess, the absence of a big red button leads to the need for the big red button. So the presence of a big red button leads to behaviors that perpetuate the need for the big red button to be used.
Yeah,
just its mere existence encourages its use. Yeah.
Because we're human.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely right. It's kind of like the kid who always knows that their parents will bail them out. They'll behave in a way that will necessitate their parents always having to bail them out. Whereas if you take the pain just once, a sharp enough pain early enough, it will embed. It will, I've had to learn this as an adult with many of my failed endeavors. And eventually I had to fail badly enough for me to really understand the lessons that life has been trying to teach me in my adulthood that I'd always sort of ignored because I have a very strong level of self-confidence and belief in my abilities. But I'd always been reckless with the pursuit of my goals with respect to risk management. Because I'm a very sort of idealist person. I fall in love with my ideas all the time. And it was only when actually I failed so badly that it really hurt. Like it traumatized me. Even now, I don't like talking about it at all. And deep breath. Like I have to inhale very deeply to lower the cortisol levels. Even like it's been more than 10 years, right? Wow. And so even with the success of what I'm enjoying right now, I can never let go of those feelings. And if you have an experience, it doesn't have to be that traumatic, but if you have an experience that teaches you that no one's going to come to save you, you behave accordingly.
Yeah.
And that one failure, that ultimate failure that I had, that eventually taught me the lessons that I needed to learn, they shaped my behaviors to this day. It's the only thing that curtails my natural confidence and exuberance. And whenever I'm feeling really sort of bubbly about an idea where I'm going to deploy some resources, that thought in the back of my mind, that feeling from 10 years ago, it's right there. It's right there, like the little sort of voice in your head, reminding me to be more prudent, to be cautious, to understand what's going on. And quite often when I'm reminding myself, if anybody ever witnesses these kinds of reminders to myself, so in person, if I'm ever sharing that, it might sound like I'm a shell of myself, but it's quite the opposite. Like, I have no shortage of confidence. It's just I'm reminding myself, don't be an arse again.
and that's led to better decision making.
Much better decision making, much better risk management. I respect risks now, whereas I was very reckless before, and a lot of that was ego driven. And I say this because I can recognize the same behaviors across society and in government in the way that we manage risks. And it's really like it's pedal to the metal. And the people who are driving a Wall Street, and they're pushing this sort of reckless behavior into society with the products that they sell. And people think they can't really help themselves en masse. Like, I have a saying that, one person's failure is a moral failing on their part. But if millions of people are failing in the same way, that's a policy failure more than an individual's failure.
Or a policy success. Depends what the motivation was.
Correct. That's a very good point to make, because quite often the failure is an inevitable outcome of the policy. And someone takes their bonus and goes home and buys a mansion or the Ferrari or the holiday home, and we're all left to pick up the pieces.
Well, you judge the purpose of a system by what it delivers.
That's a very profound point. And quite often it's repeated glibly, but in the context of what we're discussing, it's so on point, isn't it?
It's absolutely what it is. This is by design. It is what will always happen when you retain optionality to corrupt the money. The money will be corrupted, and then the corruption will be protected.
I am really interested in orange pilling. I am fascinated by orange pilling, and the way I see a lot of Bitcoin maxis, especially online, try to orange pill is almost as a demonstration of, look how much I know, aren't you stupid, sort of approach to people who are sometimes very politely inquiring, and it's quite a defeatist way of approaching someone who doesn't quite know maybe as much as you do, or might be sort of ideologically just still stuck in a different framework, a different paradigm. So I'm really interested in the first time you made this presentation. Can you share with us what the reactions were from some of the people who were in the group, in the audience?
I could tell straight away that this was a major unlock, because I'd talked to people before, and had some success sharing the way that I think about things in general, money, and therefore why Bitcoin is so important. But I hadn't had to formalize it in any sort of material to share in a sort of structured way. And it was only by being invited that forced me to do this. I'm very grateful to my friend for even inviting me to that weekend, or else, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. But just going through that presentation with these people in the room, and they did not know what it was about. They just knew it was called What's the Problem? And there's about 15 of them. And as I was going through, you could tell people were super engaged. And as I went through, I could see people beginning to smile, like they'd see a word and they were nodding, like, okay, they're a Bitcoiner already, because I didn't know them. But we had such a range. We had people who were Bitcoin. There was one Bitcoin maxi. Had a few others who had bought Bitcoin, also bought crypto. Some who, crypto, no Bitcoin.
Sure.
Some who not done anything. Some who never even questioned any of this stuff. It's just so foreign. But I was blown away by the response, because it appealed to all of them. And I was like, this is like some magic key, because it rooted them in the issues and then gave them the mental framework. The Bitcoiner is like, that's just a great way to explain it.
So that's a really key point, really. Whenever you're looking to sell a message or anything. Like it's sales 101. You got to meet people where they are, identify what their pain points are. Now, you obviously know enough about society to understand there are some universal pain points that you highlight in your presentation that resonated, it connected immediately. And from that point on, what happened?
Well, it was meant to be 30 minutes. I did the presentation in 30 minutes. Then we stood around with another 30 minutes of questions because people, they were hitting all of the points that they have been programmed with from the media. What about this? What about that? What about the other? And there was one guy there who just sat in silence. And then at the end, just like, oh my God, this is exactly what happened. Because he was from Lebanon. And he was like, I never put it together before, but this is exactly what happened. Because, you have, we sit here in the UK or in Australia or the US, Europe, and we see our money melting. We feel it, but it's not killing us at such a speed that you're motivated. It becomes the primary driver of solving it for what you do on a day-to-day basis. But if you're in Lebanon, absolutely it is. You spend a good portion of your time just trying to get better money.
Yeah, Lebanese have gone from financial crisis to financial crisis. It has a notoriously corrupt government and financial regulators and all the rest of that. And there were videos as recently as perhaps even 18 months ago, 2 years ago, where there were riots of people at banks trying to take their money out because the banks had basically frozen all the funds. You weren't able to take your money out any longer. And for a lot of those people, Bitcoin was a lifeline. Yeah.
Yeah, but you've got to be outside the system to take advantage of it.
Mm.
You can't look for Bitcoin when something happens. You need to look for Bitcoin before something happens.
Yeah. And when we talk about currency collapse, this is not a theoretical proposition. Like if you're living in a wealthy, relatively stable country, currency collapse is something that is kind of like a fantastic proposition. Like that never happened. A fantasy. I don't mean fantastic in a good way.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a fantasy. It doesn't really happen. But like my parents are from Turkey. Turkey's currency has been reset multiple times in the last 40 years. Lebanese, same thing. In Argentina, we know Michael Saylor has spoken about his experience, his direct experience with Argentina's currency collapse and losing assets there, where you literally can't get your money out of the country. Yeah. So these things happen everywhere. And I just want to say, like, if you think it can't happen to you where you are right now, and I want to say this, I've said this many times about COVID, I never thought I would see adults in a supermarket fighting over toilet paper, but that happened during COVID. Like, we are living in highly uncertain and volatile times. It can happen. It can happen, and it happens so fast that, the Lebanese are not stupid people to have got their money caught in a bank. They just were lulled into a false sense of stability and, security. It happens so fast that people get caught out.
It's already happening. This isn't something which is not occurring and is a risk on the horizon. We are in the midst of it. It's just the rate of it which is different.
So can you talk about why people don't feel that acutely at the moment then?
Well, people are very aware of inflation. All of this comes back to inflation. You hit the big red button. The government hits the big red button, government/central bank. I use them sort of interchangeably because people don't necessarily understand the difference, and it opens up a whole new kind of worms, because the whole what's the problem is abstracting away the complexity and trying to lay it out in human cause and effect. But when you hit the big red button, you are printing money, you're expanding the monetary base. You can also hit the big red button and change the other aspects of the money, like being able to hold it yourself versus putting it in the banks. But let's leave that for now and focus just on the money printing. But that is equally as important, especially when it comes to trying to step outside the system, like for Lebanon. But when you print that extra money, the government prints the extra money, that finds its way into the economy. But it finds its way into the economy to the people connected directly or indirectly to the government. And so going back to Fiatello's world, we'll use that as an example. Before we pressed it, you had perfect money. So the only reason prices would change for anything in the economy is because of demand and supply. And so prices are trending down as productivity makes supply easier at lower cost, and quality is going up because through competition and the natural evolution of the free market. But when the government starts bringing these extra Fiatellos into the economy, they look like demand. But it's not demand, it's just extra Fiatellos. So you start to see areas connected to the government start to have price imbalances.
And we can see that, for example, how Washington, D.C. has now become, the real estate market in Washington, D.C. is now the most expensive in the United States.
That's in part due to that, in part due to the way it finds its into asset prices as well, which opens up a whole separate thing, which we'll touch on in a minute. But yeah, it straddles the two because you're paying the employees and they're spending the money. But you're also driving that demand and supply imbalance in things which are contributing to the rest of the economy. So not just buying assets, it's into things which are supposed to be driving productivity or contribute to productivity in some way, so other businesses. And so those businesses then look more profitable. And in a free market, that's a signal to other people who are productive that there's extra profit margin to play for over there. And it starts to suck in people and suck in dynamic capital from the market away from the other areas of the market where they're competing. So you make the other areas more ineffective or inefficient by pulling the most productive people closer to the government to erode and compete for this profit margin which has been introduced because you printed more Fiatellos, not because demand went up. So you're corrupting the price signals in the free market. And when those businesses start going through their processes, they're spending money with other businesses and on human beings, other raw inputs and things. And so gradually over time, all the businesses in the economy starts to see their input costs going up. But their input costs are going up as a downstream effect of the money printing. That's it.
Yeah.
And so every business is then faced with a choice. How do we protect our profit margin? Because for businesses to even exist, for somebody runs a business. And the vast majority of the economy is small businesses, family businesses, small, medium enterprises. We see the big brands, but they're a very small percentage of the overall. Right? But as an entrepreneur, you are only going to invest your time and energy if the reward balances the risk. If my profit margin's getting eroded and I'm still taking the same risk, then I'm less likely to carry on running that business. I'll just close it down or go and work for someone else. I don't need the stress because the reward isn't there. So to make that equation work, you've got to restore your profit margins again. And so if you restore your profit margins again, you need to find some way of increasing your price or cutting your costs. And so the easiest thing to do is just pass on the price increase to the customer. So if you're building a product, it would be product is the same size, same quality, it's now just more expensive. So just pass that cost on. Or you say, well, let's keep it the same quality. I'll just reduce it. It's now 10% smaller for the same price.
And we saw that all the way through since COVID, where the inflationary pressures have hit all consumer good manufacturers, shrinkflation,
exactly,
as they call it, all through every single consumer item. One of my joys is to have a little bit of dark chocolate most days, and they went from 100 grams to 80 grams per packet.
Wow.
And the price has obviously gone up. So the price is probably 40-50% more expensive now for less. And that's symptomatic of what's happening right across all consumer items.
Absolutely. But there's a third one as well, which is the quality's probably gone down.
Not in this instance.
Maybe not with that brand, but for a lot, which we also notice. So you've got these three levels of inflation that hit people. The first is explicit price goes up. So you're paying more for the same thing. That's obvious. What is slightly less obvious is the shrinkflation, because maybe you didn't notice it's just 10% smaller than it used to be and the price is the same. But the third is keep the price the same, the size the same, but reduce the quality. Now that's sort of hidden. Either the product breaks faster, or it's less healthy for you, or there's some other compromise in there. And that all of those things have a negative outcome for you. If they break sooner, you have to spend money again. So it is inflation. It's just not direct inflation. If it has a negative health outcome or some other negative consequence, that's a tax on you. You've converted inflation into some other negative outcome.
Sure, and we see that in everything,
obesity,
in our clothes, in our shoes, in our food, and everything. It's like if a T-shirt that you bought would have lasted 18 months to 3 years if it was, well made, suddenly 6 months and it's done, and you're having to buy 3 different pairs, of T-shirts. And we were seeing that everywhere where quality is, you can still get quality, but it's at such a premium to what it was previously.
But this is all inflation. But people wouldn't necessarily think about that quality deteriorations being inflation. But they're all just manifestations of inflation. They're all because of the money printer. And so, when you're asking about how did inflation affect people's lives, the fact that, we're already on that spiral to zero purchasing power. We're already in that currency collapse. It's just much slower than it is in Lebanon. But it manifests itself in all of these different ways, because the money printing is, explicit, but it has these downstream effects that we then don't tie back to the money printer. So we can see everything is deteriorating around us.
I feel like the whole inflation thing is a managed trick show, really, where I know a lot of. We're going back in time now when I guess the economy in this country, certainly in Australia, was much more heavily unionised, and collective bargaining was a means of fixing wages for large sections of the economy. And a lot of these agreements would have a CPI component. So you would agree to CPI, and that would be embedded into the contract. It might be a 5-year agreement, it might be a 10-year agreement, whatever it is, but you've got a CPI component in there. Yeah. Suddenly, you change the calculation of CPI. So it's not only just a means of repression in the free market for the goods that you buy, but it's also for large sections of society in terms of how their wages are set as well. And so we had that happen, but we have much lower levels of unionization now, but we have a much greater effort on changing the CPI calculations, almost as a means of managing the message so that there's not some mass awareness of what's happening in the market, and as such, people alter their expectations in the job market, in the consumption habits and everything else. Because I just can't understand any way that an economist is using the official numbers in any major organization as a means of seriously making economic and budgetary decisions. It just doesn't make any sense, because they were understated all the way through the COVID-inspired inflation wave. Yeah. And then and now it seems that they're kind of overestimating what inflation is now. So there's various measures. Trueflation is one of them that suggests that actually inflation might be a little bit lower than the official numbers are suggesting as well. So
I would say several things. Firstly, don't underestimate people's willingness just to accept authority when it comes to these things. The government / central bank says inflation is X, therefore inflation must be X. The reality of everyone's lives is you realize that's just not the case.
And I guess that's kind of my point. And I think it's leading to an erosion in trust, because people are saying there's no way inflation is 4%. my basket of goods has gone up 25% compared to last year. My electricity bill, my gas bill has gone up 40% in 5 years. How can it only be 4%? And I guess the answer to that is that's because it's all excluded from the calculation. Like food, rent, power is all excluded as non-core. And they use terminology like core to you and me has the connotation of essential, my essential spending items. But that's not how the central banks look at calculation of inflation. Core means something entirely different. It just means non-volatile to them.
Yeah.
So what the hell is the point of?
There's a combination of two things. It's obfuscation and flexibility in rule setting. Just like they can change the rules of the game by pressing the big red button, they can change the rules of the game whenever they want because CPI is an artificial construct, right? And they can change what the construct means. And it's obfuscation as well because inflation is not just the prices of a good going up. It's the deterioration of the quality. And so even if you said it's 2% and the price went up 2% in the shop, the product's still worse. Like there are these levels to inflation. There's visible, there's semi-visible, and there's hidden. If you have to buy something twice as frequently because the quality's deteriorated, that's inflation. Wouldn't be inflation in the basket. Okay, so there's different aspects of it, and the obfuscation is also in, and you see this across finance just generally. The way that things are explained, or the mechanisms and the explanations of the mechanisms, are highly inaccessible to the average person, to the point that they then just become largely ignored or trusted because they are inaccessible. And it's those combinations of things which are just really insidious. But ultimately, even just the visible inflation is entirely a monetary phenomenon. They have increased the monetary base and stolen the productivity gains that should be accruing to the population. Prices should be going down and quality going up. So the central bank is stealing those productivity gains, and then it's printing money on top. So inflation of 2% is really just inflation of 5%. And it's not really 2%. It's 8%.
Yeah, people have stopped trusting the numbers. I remember a while ago, it might have been the back end of sort of Gordon Brown's tenure or something like that, right? It was during the election campaign. And they might have been doing like a campaign stop somewhere, and this woman in the middle of wherever, countryside of the UK, and she was complaining about something, and the riposte was, the GDP's going up. And she's like, yeah, that's your GDP, not mine. And at the time, it sounded kind of dumb.
Yeah.
But actually there was a wisdom in that, because
there is,
much like everybody's inflation is different, there's no such thing as inflation for everybody, because it depends on your consumption habits, your bill of goods, right? Everyone has a different level of inflation. And she's absolutely right. GDP increases in some sectors more than others, and in some areas of the country more than others. And if a government is not investing in all areas of the country in order that, so that there's no areas of neglect, for example, and opportunity is abound, everyone has a different level of GDP as well.
They do, but even GDP is just an arbitrary construct.
Sure.
It's held out as this measure on which success is evaluated. GDP is X% of growth in GDP. Well, if you're printing money and you're measuring the GDP in that money, absolutely it should be going up, or else you're really doing something badly. Right? If I just create more money, then of course my GDP should be going up. The GDP doesn't mean anything. And this is, the whole foundation of economics now is that inflation is a good thing. The central banks actively target inflation. They tell you, we're going to try and steal 2% from you every year. That's all it is. It's theft.
Yeah.
It is theft. And, we all know it's theft, because no one should be able to print for free what you have to work for. The impact of inflation is to say, the equivalent is to say, we're going to take 2% out of your bank account every year. There'll be uproar.
Yeah.
right? It's the same. Absolutely the same.
Well, here's the thing. They get you on both sides, right? Because inflation happens to basically all of us at the same time, essentially. But the money printing benefits some people before others.
Yeah.
And it does matter the order in which you're exposed to the money printing. And what we call the Cantillion Effect, one of the things that I learned from watching Max and Stacey from very early on is they introduced the concept to me of the Cantillion Effect, which essentially is he who is closest to the money printer benefits the most. And the reason for that is, well, you're getting new money before it's hit the demand curve.
Yeah.
And so prices haven't risen yet. You get to buy at existing prices with new money. The person who gets it last, by the time they get that flow on that so-called trickle-down effect of economic theory, price levels have risen. Asset prices have gone up. And by the time you get it, it's of no value to you.
Yeah. So this comes back to your Washington, D.C. housing market.
Yes, correct.
Right? So the money going from the government is going both to industry and people connected to the government.
So we can use two examples for this, because you mentioned one of the key things that I want to just touch on is a resource misallocation.
Mm-hmm.
And so Washington, D.C. is symbolic of people who are connected to government, and then Wall Street through industry, as an industry which has benefited from the Cantillion effect and the financialization of the economy.
Yeah.
Now, Wall Street, as a result, has sucked in enormous amounts of technical talent from the rest of the economy. We're talking engineers, scientists, everybody else who would otherwise be building new technology, innovating new scientific methods, and building a base for the economy to continue to prosper and flourish and all of those lovely things. Suddenly, they're building spreadsheets, they're finding new ways of trading arbitrage, all of these different things, which, in the long run, I think it's a kind of a drain on the economy for really talented people to be doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's because of the existence of the big red button. That optionality enables all of this. And so, yeah, the corruption of the price signals in the free market due to the money printing reaching the rest of the economy distorts everything and brings everyone closer to the government. Now, close to the government doesn't mean necessarily working for the government, but if you're working for the banks, you're working for the government by proxy, or you have an abusive position in society relative to everybody else. And it takes two aspects. So, for the Cantillion effect, it's about access to the new money sooner. So you have the money you're able to invest in assets before the asset price rises due to the inflation in the amount of money percolates through the rest of the economy. But it's also the terms on which you get access to that money.
You want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. And so when you go to the bank and you ask for a loan, the rate that you get from the bank is going to be very different from what the bank gets from the central bank. Now, to some degree, as you move further and further to smaller and smaller entities within the economy, there is certainly a difference in terms of credit worthiness for a loan. Okay. But often it's backed by assets. Whereas the closer you are to the big red button, the greater level of preferential treatment you get on borrowing money. So you have the banks closest to the central bank who can borrow it at effectively the overnight rate, and then they lend it out for a spread, and they lend it out for a spread. And the people who are furthest away get access to the money, but just on much worse terms.
You get it at worse terms to buy assets that are at much higher prices.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Exactly. And so the big red button drives the third pillar. So the first is this distortion of the price signals, which then feeds into the inflation in every aspect of commerce because of the way the money flows through, and then the decision making that every business has to go through, as we talked about, and then the visible, semi-visible, and hidden inflation, which goes through everything. And then the third is the asset inflation. And it's in part because of the Cantillion effect. People buy assets sooner. But in part, it's because of the realization that people have because the big red button exists. I'll explain what this means. Like, because the big red button exists, because money is being printed, you see the effects from the inflation. And then you either explicitly or implicitly understand you can't save anymore. If you get paid a day's wages, you cannot reliably keep that purchasing power in monetary form in the bank because it's being eroded through inflation. And so once you go down that route, what does that then mean that you do? It means any money that you have, as long as you're surviving day to day and people are, working to live. But if you reach a point where you actually are able to accrue some savings, your ability to protect those savings over time is materially impaired if you hold them in cash. So what do? You buy assets. You didn't get the money first. The asset prices are already going up because other people got the money.
Yeah.
Newly printed money. But it forces you to buy the assets as well. And so you start to see not only the asset rises through the Cantillon effect, but the asset rises through the knock-on consequences of the Cantillon effect, because everybody is forced to buy the assets because the currency is going to zero. And so it drives a greater amount of leverage. It drives more lending for the banks. It makes the banks more profitable. It indebts everybody at every level of society, and therefore you are individually leveraged, your company is leveraged, your state is leveraged, and you can never step off the treadmill because now you're just having to work to service the debt. And you become, like serfs again, effectively, but it's all downstream of the money printer. There's no way to step out.
That's a really important point that you make about serfdom. It's a very harsh terminology, but being on that treadmill, you may not think of it in such harsh and acute terms, but if I can just give an example of something that is a much more acute situation, but the same circumstances. If you live in a country that has hyperinflation, anything above 30 or 40%, people in those countries convert their savings into any asset. They will buy a bike, they will buy a tire, they will buy anything that is practical and resellable rather than hold it in the local currency, because it will retain value more than holding it in cash. Now, in a developed country, you may not feel like you are in a situation as desperate as that person living under hyperinflation. That's because you're probably investing in stocks and you have the misapprehension that you're some kind of mini Warren Buffett. But essentially the same forces are pushing you towards becoming a mini hedge fund manager you have to do all of those things, but it's the same force, but it's just milder.
Yeah.
And
slower.
so you don't feel the same desperation as a person living in hyperinflation, but it's the same forces that are doing that. And then notwithstanding actually all the errors in stock picking that you're making and what sort of cost that incurs, and the time lost that you could have otherwise be spent with family, perhaps becoming a better professional at your job. We shouldn't have to become hedge fund managers in order not to lose purchasing power with our savings.
But we are. And
Exactly.
we all know this.
We have a sense of it, don't we? But we don't really articulate it in the way that we
intuitively know.
But I think some people have the feeling that actually that they're doing something that other rich people do, and they feel like it's just an activity that richer people do, and so I'm doing that because I want to become richer. It's not something that they feel they're doing out of desperation.
That's true, but at some level they know they're doing it because they can't keep the money in the bank and retain the purchasing power, whether they acknowledge it or not. Right? If they can conflate it with aspiration of behavior to say, I want to be like this group of people. But the core issue is still the same. But you're absolutely right. But to talk about those countries with hyperinflation, what they are effectively doing is using anything else as a store of value over and above your currency. Now, for us, we have access to, most of the West. If you are the right person, because there's barriers in society, whether you can access the stock market. Not everybody can. But even when you access the stock market, you're doing that on a stack of promises. You don't actually physically own it. If you go and buy a bicycle, you have a bicycle. You can take that bicycle somewhere else. You buy a share, you have a promise. You don't even know which institution holds the share. And that can be taken off you like that. Much harder to come and take your bicycle. Someone has to physically come and take it out of your hands. And so there's storing your value. It's like a matrix. It's like storing your value in terms of the quality of the asset, and storing your value in terms of the level of protection you have in that asset. The bicycle is a very poor store of value, right? But it's a high level of protection. Someone has to come and wrest it out of your hands.
You have sovereignty with a bicycle.
You have sovereignty with a bicycle. Not a phrase I expected us to be saying today, but on that matrix, it's there. If you are investing in the stock market or something like that, you have.
That's going to be a key takeaway from this podcast.
Yeah, that's going to be the cliff, and people are going to go, "What?
You have sovereignty with the bicycle. Learn more. Click on this link." Sorry, mate. I'm interrupting your flow of thought.
No, you're right. You're right. You're right to do so. Stock market is low sovereignty, but higher quality. And so everybody, whether they realize it or not, and more people are realizing it, they're trying to solve for this matrix. It's like, how can I protect my savings, my wealth, my economic energy with the highest form of protection? And you're picking off a menu of things. Now, one axis of that matrix may be more relevant for you, or maybe less relevant for you, depending on whereabouts you are in the world and how keenly you feel the creep of authoritarianism on the one hand, on the one axis, and inflation on the other axis. But everybody's somewhere in the matrix. But the core characteristics of fiat currency mean it's all going to zero in purchasing power in the long run. So over time, everybody just naturally moves through that matrix to the point that gives you the highest quality store of value, store of your economic energy, with the highest level of sovereignty. And that's Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the gravitational well in this matrix that's just going to consume everything over time. Because the characteristics of it on both axes are unsurpassable. And everything is just running downhill into that black hole. It's just a question of the speed and the path it takes. And sitting in the West, many people haven't really thought about these things, but they can feel the creep. They can feel the creep all around them. Before we came on, we were talking about, the levels of flexibility that you have in terms of your asset ownership or thresholds and, pensions and all of these sorts of things. The limits come down all the time in terms of what you are allowed to own, what you have the freedom to transact with. They come down all the time in nominal fiat terms at the same time as inflation's going up. So, £10,000 limit today is much less than a £10,000 limit in 10 years' time because of inflation. But the limits are coming down. So what's gradually happening is our ability to be sovereign to any degree whatsoever for any asset is gradually being removed to the point that we will have none. That the money you have in the bank is not yours. The fiat money you have in the bank is yours with permission.
Yeah, I felt that frustration anytime I tried to move a certain amount to buy more Bitcoin, for example. There was one instance, well, it was over a couple of days, where the bank went through a bunch. It's a scripted sort of conversation where they ostensibly they're trying to mitigate the risk of fraud, right? But the very next day, I had to break up a particular transaction into two separate amounts because they wouldn't allow me to send it to the exchange to buy more Bitcoin. The next day, I had to go through the same 25-minute conversation, same scripted conversation. So it's not about mitigating risk, because if it was, you would say, yep, we've gone through this with the customer. They're aware of it. It's fine. Tick this box. Don't bother him for the next 90 days or whatever it might be. Yeah. But instead what they do is they try to frustrate you at every single opportunity. The transaction will not go through to an exchange. They will flag you for a call, and you have to go through that 25-minute conversation every single time. Now, I've worked in banks. They do not like to expend resources for no reason. There's a particular purpose behind that. It's either to frustrate the hell out of you so that you leave, or there's some kind of hidden mandate for them to make it difficult for people to take their money out of the system.
Yeah, it's trying to shut the escape routes. Because going back to the video, Fiatello's side degrades to such an extent that he's having to hit the big red button all the time, because he lives in a world that looks like today. He's having to go from 2008 800 billion to a couple of trillion to the next one. It will be 10 trillion.
Because importantly, there's no such limit. And there are no onerous sort of conversations when I want to send a larger amount to anybody else at another bank, for example, if I was paying a supplier. No problem.
It's being inside the system versus outside the system. Yeah. And so when you're trapped inside a fiat system and someone has access to a big red button, the inevitable outcome is the purchasing power of the unit of currency used in the system goes to zero, because the button gets pressed and there is no escape. Everyone measures their wealth, everyone transacts their wealth in a unit which somebody else can control the supply of, and you have to pay the taxes in that unit, in that currency. So it goes to zero. Right? Assets still exist, but the assets, when the value of the assets when measured in the currency goes to infinity. This is a hyperinflation. The assets haven't expanded. It's just the money has expanded. This is why, Zimbabwe is the best performing stock market during hyperinflation, because it's the amount of currency that's changed. And so, but when you're inside the system, it's safe. Your assets and your wealth can be expropriated by the state through a combination of the money printer, the rule changes for the currency, and taxation. So you need to exist outside the system. You need to own something which within that matrix is your apex on both counts. It is your apex store of value to protect your wealth, and it's the apex for self-sovereignty, so you don't require permission and nobody can take it from you. You restore self-sovereignty over your time and energy and your humanity effectively. And now you're outside the system. And your interaction with the system is optional. It's not mandatory anymore. No permission is required of anybody else on your behalf. And so when you have a fiat system and when the currency is going to zero, the government becomes increasingly protective of people trying to leave the system. Because if you leave the system dies faster. The system's still dying. The system will die. It's just going to die faster as people leave it. Now, that guy buying a bicycle, he's sort of leaving the system, but they can still arrive and take the bicycle. If he has Bitcoin, they have to physically get the information out of him. They'd have to resort to violence to get the information out of him. They cannot take it, voluntarily take it. And so there's a difference, being inside and being outside the system. And it's this matrix that people are solving for, and ultimately everyone will end up at that point. And, fiat is dying.
Do you think so? I want to take you up on that point because it's debasing, but is it dying? Because my theory is that any functional state will always retain the ability to issue its own currency, hence the red button.
Yeah.
Right. And an inability to print its own currency will effectively mean that it doesn't even have the trust of its own citizens. It's no longer a functional state. It doesn't have the trust of its citizens in order to be able to print its own currency. So is it as important that the big red button disappears or that we embrace Bitcoin? Because I don't think the big red button's going anywhere. Even if we experience a currency collapse in this country, we've seen it in Turkey. Turkey's currency has collapsed. They just have a reset. And life goes on after that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great economic catastrophe. But my point is faith in the state doesn't just disappear, and it doesn't simply lose its ability to issue its own currency.
That's absolutely true. The difference is for the very first time you have something that exists outside the system. Everything else exists inside the system. And so when something exists outside the system, you have the escape route. And we both know when you make that leap, it's a one-way door. Once you recognize what fiat is, you connect the dots to why Bitcoin is important. You absolutely have to own Bitcoin. And no one ever goes back. So what happens over time is just more and more people find the door, they walk through the door, and the system continues its decline to zero. Now, resetting the system periodically will be required because the purchasing power will go to zero repeatedly. As you say, nobody is going to willingly give up the big red button. But you have to have people who are willing to play by those rules. And people are willing to play by the rules of fiat right now because there is, for the vast majority of people, they don't exist outside the system. They can be compelled. They are being compelled to play by the rules dictated by the big red button. But you don't have to. And so over time, the more people that wake up to this, they leave. The more people that find Bitcoin, the more they need to press the big red button. And the more they press the big red button, the more people find Bitcoin. To the point where pressing the big red button is completely ineffectual because the purchasing power is already zero or tending to zero. And people aren't using the currency anyway. Bitcoin is money. It's not, we talk about it as store of value. Absolutely is a store of value. It's a store of your economic energy, but it's money in the purest sense. It's peer-to-peer cash. And, we're already seeing breakout circular economies and people paying in Bitcoin, demanding to be paid in Bitcoin all around the world. And fiat governments can't stop that. Can't stop that. So you just get this natural transition that happens at a variable pace in various parts of the world as people migrate to the perfect money. The state can't fix it. It can't stop it. They can try and outlaw it, but it's ineffectual. You can make something illegal, but if you can't enforce it, you undermine your own credibility and the system dies faster. And if you make something illegal, you just drive people away. So areas of the world will outperform and migrate faster to this new world when they engage with Bitcoin. And the logical thing is to engage with Bitcoin because otherwise you lose. And so Bitcoin is eating the world. It will eat the entire world. And we'll get to the point where, yeah, great, you have a big red button, but nobody uses that money anyway. Press it as much as you like. Enjoy all the paper. everyone else is using Bitcoin.
On that note, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap that up.
All right.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming in. Can you tell people where to find you on Twitter or any website?
Yeah. Well, on X, you can find me at Satmojoe, SATMOJOE. And the documentary is called What's the Problem?
And if you just type that into YouTube, it will be like the first result. It's
you can even Google it now. It's
Yeah.
on the first. It's on the first page. It's amazing. You'll see, Pixar character. It lives at satsversusfiat.com. So Sats being short for Satoshi's, Fiat obviously being short for Fiatello, rather than fiat currency. So satsvsfiat.com. You'll find the video lives there as well as on YouTube, but all the resources also live there.
Excellent.
So when people watch the video or you share the video with friends, and this is the most important thing, that Bitcoiners are the distribution for this video. It's the thing you should have in your pocket that you can give to anybody.
It's made for people who are not already into Bitcoin, and they will not be scared off by sort of hardcore Bitcoin messaging from the outset. It leads with problems that everybody can identify with, which is why it's such a powerful piece of film. And so I thank you very much for making it, for sharing that with us, and coming into the studio and telling us your story as well.
Well, I'm just very glad to be invited. So thank you, Archie. There's a whole range of excuses you can use to send this link to someone. If they complain about pretty much anything, you can say, you should watch this video. I think you'll find it interesting. Just send them, and then chances are they'll say, that was interesting. Can you send me something else? And then you send them, The Big Prince by Larry Lepard, or Broken Money by Lynn Alden, or A Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth. That first thing, once their interest is piqued, but they'll have motivation to read them when they've watched this.
We'll put the details in the show notes as well for everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you everybody who has watched it and shared it and contributed to translating it into so many different languages and made it accessible to everybody around the world. So it's just a massive win for Bitcoiners and the community. So thank you, everybody. 270,000 views as of last night. So it's quite a success already. Yeah, but I launched it on X and just put the link to YouTube underneath. So I mean, on X, it's so much more than that. But it's also we've got 6-7 languages now. We launched Korean. Oh, that's amazing. We launched Korean yesterday, so it's in the language, and all the slides are in Korean. Wow. And in the first 24 hours, it got more views in Korea than the English one did when we launched it. So this is just volunteers around the world getting in touch, bringing their expertise and contributing to just helping the whole world understand what the problem is. That's amazing work, man. Yeah. Thank you again for coming into the studio. It's always great to have a guest in studio. It's just so much more personal. There's a deeper connection there, and storytelling is a lot stronger as well. Thanks, Joe Bryan. Well, I've loved it. Thanks, Archie.